biblical worship, when you say those words, it's obviously fraught with a lot of varying opinions. The Reformation, in particular, kind of pared down in reaction to what was perceived as excess in Catholic and Orthodox worship, icons being an example where it's perceived as being idolatrous and this sort of thing. So you have a rather sparse approach to worship. And if you go biblically, purely on the New Testament side of things, well, I mean, you have Paul saying, encourage one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. And of course, it doesn't say anything about instruments. So you have some denominations will say, well, because it doesn't say anything about instruments in the New Testament, we shouldn't use instruments. We should only sing a cappella. But of course, if you go to the Old Testament, it is full of art. I think somebody mentioned during our meeting on Saturday that 70% of the Old Testament is art, and whether it's poetry or story. And of course, their worship was full of not just music, and music of wide variety, but also dance. It's like these are expressions of worship that it's a very rich tradition. So the thing that I think about is that you look at the person of Jesus and the people who inhabited the beginnings of the church in the New Testament, and of course they were all Jewish, right? And so they inherited this tradition. I mean, Christ would have taught, and we know he taught in the synagogue, in the temple, and we see in the Old Testament how the detail, for instance, of the tabernacle, and that God is actually very interested in the beauty with which these buildings, these structures were created. And Jesus told stories primarily. I mean, you can remember when there's the one passage where his disciples say, "Finally, you're speaking plainly. You've been speaking in parables the whole time." Jesus seemed to be actually rather comfortable with leaving things open for people to think about by creatively creating a space where people could contemplate what he was talking about. Why did he tell the story of the prodigal son instead of just preaching a sermon on the forgiveness of God? And leaving it open-ended. But look at the richness of interpretation of that parable over the centuries, whether it's from the pulpit or Rembrandt's The Prodigal, or it's just like this is by expressing it artistically and leaving it open-ended. People are, they're free to misinterpret it. But again, Jesus seemed to be kind of okay with that by not nailing it down. But also they're free to truly contemplate it. And that space that's created, that artistic, contemplative space, the Holy Spirit inhabits that space, and we are allowed to be drawn in to true worship. Again, not simply, or I shouldn't even say simply, but not only through the preaching of the word, very direct communication, but also through these more open-ended artistic forms.